Hi, my name is Hillary Mulick and I am a wedding photographer based in North Carolina, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Here on my channel, I share education for photographers that includes business, marketing, and little peeks into my personal life here in the Carolinas. Before we get started with today's topic, make sure to download my free guide in the description, How to Get 10 Storytelling Images with Just One Pose. It's my secret to getting a variety of images for a session without moving my clients around constantly. It helps keep them calm and relaxed while also allowing me to get a variety of images, and it makes my clients so happy to have that variety in their final gallery. So make sure to download that free guide. All right, so today's topic is what are my go-to camera settings when I'm shooting any type of portrait session or a different event on a wedding day. When I first started shooting weddings, anytime I would second shoot, I would always ask the photographers that I was second shooting for what their camera settings were at when they were photographing specific things. Because I was always really interested how they were able to produce certain types of images and certain styles and what their camera settings were at while they were shooting those different types of things. Because as we know, you can line 5 different photographers up and give them the same exact subject, and depending on what their style is, they're going to have their camera settings all set at different things in order to produce a certain result at the end for that specific image, depending on what their style is. So my style is more romantic, more timeless. I really love that softness to an image. I think it really makes that romantic, timeless look. And so I'm going to share with you today what my camera settings are generally at when photographing portraits and just different parts of the wedding day so that I'm able to get my style of images in the end straight out of camera. So the very first thing that I do when I am setting my camera settings is I set my ISO. And I usually like to set my ISO at 400, and I usually leave it there for the majority of the portrait session. Unless it starts to get a little bit dark, then I might bump my ISO up a little bit. So for portrait sessions, I usually start my ISO at about 400. For wedding days, I do the same, and as it gets darker or as I'm photographing different things on the wedding day, such as, the reception, or when I'm using flash and different things, I'm going to change my ISO up, but my starting point is always ISO 400. The next thing I'm going to set is my white balance. I personally like to shoot in Kelvin. I think it's really easy to be able to set your Kelvin number, and it makes editing in post a lot easier because the temperature of all of your images for that segment of the day are going to be the same because you set your Kelvin to a specific number. And that's why I don't like shooting in auto white balance, because I find when I'm editing those images, the camera shifts the white balance a little bit between every image depending on what you're photographing, and I think it makes editing take a lot longer because you're having to make tiny little adjustments to the temperature per image. Whereas if I'm setting my white balance to a certain number and shooting that section of the day at that number, when I'm editing in post, I can do more of a batch edit and select multiple images and change that temperature if I need to, rather than having to go through each individual image. So for me, when I am starting to photograph something, I usually set my Kelvin to 5,500, and that's usually the starting point. I take a test shot and see what that looks like, see if it needs to be a little bit cooler, a little bit warmer, but generally I like to start at 5,500. That's my sweet spot for setting my Kelvin with white balance. So the third thing I do is I set my aperture. Now, like I mentioned earlier, my style of photography is very soft and romantic and timeless, so I love shooting at those low aperture numbers where I'm shooting wide open and it's really honing in on a certain part of the image and blurring everything else out. So I love shooting majority of my portrait sessions, and honestly majority of the wedding day, at about 2.0. That's my go-to camera setting. And then at different parts of the day, I might switch my aperture to other things. So for example, if I'm shooting flat lays, I usually shoot those at 4.0 for a full flat lay, and then I'll change to 2.0 when I'm zooming in on different aspects of the flat lay. If I am shooting wedding party, I'll usually do that between 2.8 and 4.0. For family sessions, I usually do about 5.6 or not family sessions, but family formals on a wedding day. Because I think those need to be very crisp because there are lots of people and they're going to be printed. Everyone needs to be in focus. So I usually do 5.6 just to make it safe. And then for dancing shots, I think I usually do 2.0 or 2.8. But majority of the wedding day for portraits and just different events, speeches, details, I'm usually shooting at about 2.0. So that's my go-to aperture for portrait sessions and for a wedding day. The very last thing that I set when it comes to camera settings is shutter speed. And I don't care very much about shutter speed. I usually just make my shutter speed whatever number it needs to be after I've set everything else up in order to get the exposure that I want. But I will say that if I'm photographing something that has motion, for example, people walking down the aisle or, you know, a walking shot, and I don't want that blur in it, I usually try and keep it at 1/250th of a second at least or higher. If I'm going lower than that, like 1/125th of a second or even lower than that, you're going to risk some motion blur, which if I'm doing portraits, I actually like the motion blur because it just makes it look a lot more romantic looking. But for certain aspects, especially if you're shooting a wedding and the motion part of whatever you're photographing needs to be in focus, I wouldn't go any lower than 1/250th of a second. All right, and those are my camera settings. So we went over starting with ISO, then going to white balance, which I shoot in Kelvin, then going to aperture, which my go-to is 2.0, and then last but not least, shutter speed, which I just usually go with whatever shutter speed is going to make the exposure that I want it to look. And I don't really have a specific go-to number for that. I hope that was helpful. And if you love my style of photography and you are wanting to incorporate that romantic, timeless style into your own photography, then use these camera settings and adjust from there. And I'll see you again next week with another YouTube video.